Whether or not to protect yourself from the elements is a fundamental human choice that should be protected. And then she found it was not in accordance with the principle of fundamental justice. That was another thing we had to prove. So we had to prove the deprivation and not in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. She found that it was overbroad and it was arbitrary because as long as people were going to be sleeping outside, you were still going to have damage to turf, you were still going to have whatever problems the city outlined. Those mostly arose from a homeless population that had no place else to go, and I would add the lack of infrastructure to protect them. So a lot of the problems that they say arise from things like tent cities don't arise from the existence of the tent city. They arise from the fact that there's not proper facilities to support those tent cities. So, having said tent city and her judgment in the same sense, I have to say right off the bat that she specifically said the question of a tent city was not before her. And I'll come back to that in just a second, what was before and what wasn't. But just to finish sort of who had to prove what, we had to prove the deprivation of life, liberty, and security of the person. We had to prove not in accordance with principles of fundamental justice. And then the city had a chance to prove that nevertheless this charter breach was justified. As being reasonably and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And she found that they didn't discharge that burden. They didn't show that they couldn't have done something that was less rights impairing than this, that would have still met their legitimate needs. So as a result, she found for us, she accepted our argument that the bylaws were a breach of Section 7, insofar and only insofar, she says, as they prohibit homeless people from erecting shelter. So that doesn't mean that everyone can erect shelter. It means that the prohibition against homeless people erecting shelter is overbroad and can't be sustained. Now, as Irene's explained, the cumulative effect of these bylaws was that nobody could sleep anywhere in Victoria. It wasn't that there were some places you could sleep and some places you couldn't, and sometimes that you could and sometimes that you couldn't. It was that there was no place you could sleep. And we weren't arguing that you had to be able to sleep anywhere at any time. We were arguing that you had to be able to sleep somewhere. And rather than refashion the bylaw and say, well, I'm going to read this bylaw down so that it says you can only prohibit tents only between certain hours or only in certain locations or things like that. She said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to strike down the bylaw. And the reason she did that, the reason why courts prefer to do that than to do something bylaw is because they want to respect the political process. And she thought there were a whole bunch of ways that the city of Victoria might want to legislate to balance the interests it has, the legitimate interests it has in preserving parks and ensuring that everyone has access to parks and the rights of homeless people to live with security and dignity. There's a variety of ways that they could do that, and she left it up to them to do that. So the current prohibition is struck down, and she leaves it to Victoria to decide what they're going to do. Now, a lot of people ask, so what's the precedential value for this for other places? Well, sort of depends on what the circumstances are. Some of her principles should be applied across Canada. At least they have some persuasive value. In British Columbia, you would think that a judge of the same court would likely follow them if you had similar circumstances. So, I mean, this idea that people have to be able to protect themselves, that shelter is a basic necessity of life, is something that I think has huge precedential value. And, just as an aside, it's encouraging that she paid a lot of attention to Canada's international commitments with respect to housing and shelter when she made this decision, because I know many of you are very familiar with the commitments that Canada has made in the international arena to ensure that all of its citizens have safe and secure and adequate housing. And although those international commitments are not directly enforceable in Canadian courts, the Supreme Court of Canada has made it very, very clear that the content of the charter charter rights should be interpreted to provide at least as much protection as what Canada has said in the international arena that it's going to provide. And so the judge, I think, took that into account in this case in finding that the right to shelter was a basic necessity of life. So that's, I mean, what she decided. What she decided was, in this case, this bylaw was unconstitutional because people were going to be sleeping outside, and while they were sleeping outside, they needed to be able to protect themselves. It's not really very complicated. It's pretty straightforward. So, I don't know if there's anything else. I mean, I could take you through parts of her decision. My favorite paragraph is paragraph 5. So if you're going to read anything, you should read paragraph 5 as a little summary of what she's doing there. And she recognizes that it is, that shelter is a necessity of life and it's a precondition to any sort of other human flourishing. You have to be able to have these basic needs taken care of. But I think that probably it might be useful at this point to just start taking questions. Or
challenge, but to get the stories that the people have been saying out there, we, you know, the homeless and the housed and that need to start listening to each other, and we need to start listening to each other without just, you know, like saying, oh, okay, well, you know, it's them, it's them, it's them, it's like, no, it's we. Somebody was asking me about the Aboriginal issues and that around what was the name for homeless and Aboriginals, and I said that homelessness never existed in the Aboriginal communities. It's a part of the colonization series of events that happened, because in our language we don't have a word for homeless, because we just took in the people. We took in, whether it was, you know, our daughters, our sons, our granddaughters, our neighbors' granddaughters, we took them in and we never charged them rent. So, you know, tent cities, it's a foreign thing, but, you know, it's like, okay, that brings back community. It's we, the community, that are responsible. So, anyhow, questions? How would you like to
Yeah, somebody asked about the appeal. I'll just go back to that question we already got about the appeal. And just to follow up on what you were saying, Rose, about talking to each other. One thing that we really noticed when we were doing this case, you know, Irene told you the story about when Tent City was there, and people lived in one place for about 3 weeks together. They took care of each other, and they had a place to stay together. We got some very good evidence from those people. Very hard to get evidence from people that are alone on the street. Very, very difficult for people who are alone on the street to talk about what's happening to them and to make themselves heard. So to the extent that people here can do that, do it. Talk to people that are homeless if you're not homeless yourself, and then tell other people what they've said, because it's very hard sometimes for people to say it themselves. Once they get some support, they have wonderful stories that are very persuasive and were very helpful before the judge. But it's a lot to ask of people to tell those stories, and they shouldn't have to tell them very often.
City on Friday.
In terms of the appeal, I don't know what they're thinking. You know, this was the first case in Canada that addressed this, but it certainly wasn't the first case in North America to address similar issues. The U.S. cases have pretty consistently found that an absolute ban on sleeping outside is unconstitutional under the American Constitution. I don't think that in a place like Victoria there's any real difference between being able to sleep and being able to provide yourself with shelter. I mean, if you have a right to sleep but you can't provide shelter, that right to sleep is maybe illusory, or maybe it's actually dangerous.